I've always been a big fan of horror anime and manga, both of the tense, atmospheric stories that might actually frighten you or leave you with a feeling of discomfort, and of the so over-the-top ridiculous anime that just make you laugh at their insanity. And Shiki definitely falls in the first category for me. It perfectly builds tension over the first half of the story with some memorable and frightening moments while you and the characters are wondering what's going on, with increasingly worse things happening, and develops into a brutal and horrifying conclusion where you might start to wonder if your favorite character's actions could still be justified. Now, I have to say that I don't think there's a way for me to talk about why I like Shiki that much besides mentioning its beautiful music and that it has some of my favorite intense and frightening moments in anime without giving away too much of the story, or at least of the mystery of what's actually going on at first. It's also way harder to make something sound frightening, at least for me, than actually watching it and deciding for yourself. So I think if you're even a little bit interested in horror anime and slow tension building stories escalating into a memorable finale, then I would say try watching Shiki. Of course, if something is actually scary or at least very intense and uncomfortable and not just slow and boring is entirely subjective, and some might find what I think to be good, slow and horrifying storytelling to be just boring. But I think Shiki has some of the most gruesome and frightening moments in anime, and I still think back on the experiment scene. If you have seen it, then you know what I'm talking about, and the underground escape even after all these years since first watching the anime. Just don't search anything up for Shiki before watching it, because there's a certain death of a really important character that always gets shown when I see something regarding the anime, and I think it's more fun to go blind into it and find out for yourself what's going on in this village than already knowing it, even if it's still enjoyable and gets revealed relatively early on. There are also 2 special episodes that are presented separately and take place between episode 20 and 21 and 21 and 22, and these are mandatory for the full experience and to actually understand what's going on in the last episode, and contain one of my favorite scenes. Like I said with Link Click, I don't understand why some anime present certain episodes differently and not just include them as a normal episode when they are that important to the story. Episodes 20.5 and 21.5 give you a lot of context and show what happened to some characters that you otherwise wouldn't know if you just skipped these 2, and I think there's no argument for skipping these. My only guess is that the anime needed to finish with 22 episodes and cut out content that didn't show the deaths or similar moments of the 4 or 5 most important characters. These 2 special episodes were released a few months after the anime ended and are normal episodes taking place where mentioned. Please watch these at their intended place if you're interested in the anime. I think Shiki uses its setting of a small isolated town in the middle of the mountains filled with all kinds of characters ranging from surprisingly real people that I'd have no problem believing actually exist, especially compared to some other anime where you just think that that's definitely not what a person that age would do, to some over-the-top characters perfectly, and creates a good atmosphere for what's happening in the story. And while there are some typically anime-like characters, I find it surprising how many of these people behave like actual human beings with all the best and worst aspects of humanity included. It also helps that, contrary to a lot of anime, you have important characters from all kinds of ages. Kids and teenagers that actually talk and behave like someone their age, and working adults that act maturely and make believable, logical or emotional decisions based on life experience. If they think something is impossible and doesn't exist, then they don't believe it, and to be honest, I think most people, me included, also wouldn't believe something that speaks against all of your life experiences without concrete evidence that leaves no doubt. What I'm trying to say here is that I really appreciate that Shiki for the most part doesn't have your stereotypical anime characters, and instead has a lot of real feeling people that I either wouldn't doubt could actually exist or even know someone similar. And the characters that are more into your stereotypical anime direction all have a point and a reason to be that way in the story and contribute something to the narrative that supports the story. The only thing that isn't necessary for the story and might seem out of place in a horror anime with some really unnerving and disturbing scenes is the ridiculous hair some of the characters have, but come on, isn't it just glorious? I want to talk a bit more about the characters, so if you're even a little bit interested in horror anime and don't mind or even like slow tension building stories that present you with different sides of humanity and don't tell you an answer of what's the right thing to do and let you decide for yourself, then I would say try watching Shiki. Just a warning that you shouldn't expect action, and even though there are a lot of people dying early on, it's not very graphic. It will get very graphic with its violence later on, so if you don't like to see that at all, then Shiki maybe not for you, but I think even if you're not that comfortable with animated violence, there's a point to all of it in Shiki, and it's not presented as mindless entertainment, so I think it's definitely worth watching. Okay, spoilers from here on. Like I said, I really like a lot of these characters, and my favorite is probably Ozaki. He's one of the most believable characters in a scenario like Shiki, and represents a lot of what I think about when thinking of humanity, as dumb as that sounds. The want to help people and genuine care, and the brutality of someone desperate who is willing to do increasingly more questionable things for the survival of the people he cares for, and of course a whole lot more. He reminds me of a character you would find in something Yoko Taro writes, or quite a lot of Kiritsugu from Fate Zero. Of course, they still have a lot of differences, but not only are their appearances similar, they both also stop at nothing to achieve their goal of saving a group of people, even if they have to do some horrible things to get to that goal. I think one of the biggest differences is that Ozaki doesn't see what he does to be wrong. He definitely doesn't like doing it, but he sees it as the only possible solution to save the village and its people, even if that means killing every single Shiki. As long as they pose a threat to humanity, there's a need to eliminate them, and he's one of the only ones willing to actually do something early on. It's the same as when an animal that's supposed to be killed for their meat fights back and kills a human. Of course, most humans think that it's tragic that a person got killed, but you could not say that it was wrong of the animal to fight back to survive and kill its threat. I've seen some people discuss the morality of Ozaki and say that he's just as bad as the Shiki and doesn't really care for some people like his wife or others that he could have tried to save, and I will talk about the Shiki or vampires or whatever you want to call them in a moment, but I personally think that they are wrong to assume that Ozaki doesn't care for his wife or should have saved some humans who ended up dying or turning into Shiki. To me, it seemed that even though Ozaki did absolutely horrible things to Kyoko after she died and became a Shiki, he still cared about her. Not only did he apologize to her, but he also knew that he couldn't save her because he already tried that with a different patient, and there was nothing he could do back then to stop the Shiki from taking her away, and he already tried everything else he could possibly think of on dozens of people with the same symptoms over the last few weeks, so he took the path that would be the most beneficial for figuring out what to do against the Shiki, and that only he as a doctor could take. He also did everything possible for the villagers over the last few weeks, even if they thought the symptoms weren't that serious, and told them to immediately visit him if anything happened, and you can see how all this time and stress left him completely exhausted. He's just a doctor doing everything possible to help the people in his village with no thought for his own well-being, and I think his wife was the final point that showed him that all he was doing will be for nothing when everyone is dead if he's not willing to do some cruel things to a corpse to help the people still living. I'm not saying that what he did was the right decision, but I don't think you could really argue that it might have been the necessary thing to do in that situation. Another thing is that contrary to some of the other villagers who end up killing other humans that are just under the influence of Shiki or only got bitten once and would have survived and remained human, Ozaki never does anything like that and tries to stop the villagers blinded by rage killing innocent people that could have survived, so I personally think that he did care for his wife and remained one of the most logical and emotionally stable surviving humans, even if he was probably one of the characters that suffered the most. With the Shiki, I definitely think it's too complicated for me to say what would be the best thing for them to do to survive and coexist besides humans. None of them chose to be the way they are, and while they do terrible things to humans, it's only to survive. But I also think that while some of the Shiki remain logical and keep their humanity, a lot of them take pleasure in killing, like Megumi, and at that point it's not for survival anymore, but for the sake of killing, and that's where my sympathy largely stops. Toru and especially Ritsuko don't want to hurt anyone, and I just feel bad for them. Even Tsunako doesn't like what she has to do, but accepts it. But the Shiki who don't try to fight the urge to hurt humans or find a solution, even if it doesn't turn out to be possible, are worse to me than someone like Ozaki. Not only do they turn people into Shiki against their own will, but a lot of them try to force their way of life onto the Shiki who don't want to hurt others, like forcing Toru to kill Natsuno, or else his family will die, or forcing Ritsuko to hurt her colleague, who she spent years working with when they could have done something else. And when Tatsumi wants to kill Natsuno because he poses a threat to them after turning him into a Shiki, that's no better than a human threatening to kill another human. I don't think that I have the right to say what's right or wrong in a situation like Shiki, but I just wanted to share some of my thoughts and appreciate that Shiki doesn't present you with an answer either and lets you decide for yourself. What's also great is that while you could definitely argue about we as humans being the truly awful ones, the show doesn't say that, and after seeing so many stories where a character literally questions if the humans are worse than whatever they are fighting against, I just find it nice to have a story where you can have that thought, but the story doesn't force it onto you. All in all, I think Shiki is a a really interesting look at humans as a whole with interesting characters and a great horror anime. Maybe you didn't find it unsettling at all, or you had multiple moments scare you. As far as horror anime go, I think it's one of the best. I also find it a bit strange that when you search for horror anime anywhere, more than half of the suggestions are something like Tokyo Ghoul or Hellsing, or even Attack on Titan, and while these can have some intense moments, something like Death Note is definitely not a horror anime and just hides search results with actual horror anime like Shiki. I originally wanted to upload this video sooner at a more fitting time, but when I first watched Shiki a few years ago, like a lot of anime, I liked it so much that I didn't want to finish it and stopped with 2 episodes left, and when I watched it again this time, I just thought about the ending that I hadn't seen back then, and while I knew that Megumi would die because her death is always one of the first things I see when looking up something related to Shiki, the ending itself and what happens with the other characters was new to me, and I just thought about it for some time and read a bit of the manga before sitting down and working on this video. I also find it fascinating that anime made me kinda love vampires. Before watching anime, I really disliked them, but there are so many anime including all kinds of vampires that I actually like them now, and Shiki is one of my favorite more serious depictions of vampires that shows the potential of a story including them. I wish you a great rest of the day, and bye.